Our parents today are dealing with a lot of problems because the world is trying to tell us how they think parents should parent, when God has set the standard for how we should parent. God has said this is how it'll work, and we've talked about this in previous episodes. If I can make a universe, then I have the right to rule it.
Sure.
And God created man and woman and created the ability and opportunity for children to be blessed in those marriages that are supposed to happen and in this world. And so God then has the right to say, here's how your children ought to be disciplined. Here's how your children ought to be raised. Here's how you as parents ought to handle them. And I think it's twofold. Number one, a child can grow up and be an absolute terror, and the parents can allow that, which is a problem if the parents allow it, or the child is an absolute terror and just tries to do everything it can, or he or she can, to refuse to listen to the parents when they correct. There are problems with one big area of parenting, and it has caused a lot of questions and a lot of criticism, and that's spanking. That's the idea of disciplining our kids with a belt or with our hands or with something that a lot of mothers now might use spoons, like the wooden spoons to spank. What would you say, what would you do if someone says spanking's ineffective?
Well, and we need to realize there are certainly extremes when it comes to this conversation.
Right.
There are those who say absolutely you don't touch a child and really basically leave the child to raise themselves. I mean,
Right.
So that's one extreme on that. And then obviously there's abuse on the other end. And so we want to avoid either extreme, and God has given us a way that we can do that. And we need to remember too, we can see God as our Father, right, and understand that He too chastises His children. Why? To help them to grow. And so, and it has to do with training, which is the very root idea of the word discipline. And so, we don't reward bad behavior, and we help them in their good behavior to be encouraged in that, to continue in that way. Now, so when you talk about discipline, you're talking about training. You're talking about, but when we're talking about the topic of spanking, that's a part of discipline as well. And the Bible speaks to that, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But one of the things that from my vantage point, at least at this point in time, is I've seen spanking to be effective.
Right.
So effective, in fact, not harsh. That's not what I'm talking about. When I say effective, I don't mean harsh. I mean it's effective in what it's meant to accomplish. So much so that it's used even after that on the rarest of occasions. If it's used properly, if we're training properly, if we're disciplining properly, then discipline is only used in the rarest of occasions. And what I mean by that is you have to find that which is effective. Every child is different in the home, and every parent is different too. And so they have to find that place. But God has certainly given us some guidelines to help us with that. There were very extreme cases where children were so far into evil practices and so forth that would mean that their parents would be first in line even to stone those children. Mm-hmm. And that's a harsh example. That's not what we're talking about here. But before he gets to that, the idea was you train them along the way. You discipline them along the way. And so, for us and our family, for our boys, and sure, they were just little angels, right? They never got into trouble.
Right. I know them. I know them, so I don't think I can say that, but
and I joke.
Right.
But it was rare for us to have to spank them. Yet, I see the far extreme of that too, is sometimes you're going through a store somewhere, and I know parents don't like to be embarrassed because their child is acting up, and they don't like to do those things publicly, but at some point in time, and we had to do that on occasion or two, where we had to pop them on the leg or pop them on the rear end, even publicly, and yeah, you get looks from people who think, oh, you're being awful to your child. No, I'm trying to keep him in the way. I'm trying to keep him to learn what's right and what's expected behavior. And we see that in our society today, where there is no discipline, there is chaos. They're just people that are running and doing whatever they want with no This also leads to an idea where there's no respect for authority whatsoever. And so we teach our children that at a young age, and as they grow older, you don't have to discipline them as much. Not to, not from a spanking point of view, obviously. That's something that's done young, you get their attention, and then it's rare on occasions to follow after that. And again, so when the children are running the house and begin to rule the parents, something is wrong. And so God helps us in giving us those guidelines, and I'll let you expound upon that.
Excuse me. I think one of the things that's interesting with this is the same individual in that store that would give you a look for disciplining their child would give you pretty much the same look if you wouldn't have done anything.
Sure.
They would have sat there and said, you know what, they don't even have control over their children. Right. So how do we win? Yeah. It's a catch-22. How do you win? Because you can't spank your child without getting a look. You can't not spank your child without getting a look. And there is something to be said. I know there have been people who have even been in trouble with the law who have said from the stand in the courtroom, I wish I'd been spanked more as a kid. Mm-hmm. I grew up and didn't have respect for authority because I was never disciplined.
Right.
So there's something to be said about telling your child no. Now my son is just now getting to a point where he knows the word no. And he understands that when I say it or when my wife says it, it means don't do that.
Right.
And the other night, I saw him and he was crawling towards something. He's almost, he's a year old now, mm-hmm. and he was crawling toward the socket. I said, no, and he kept going. So I grabbed him and put him the other way. Well, he crawled back to it, did it. The third time I went over and I just barely touched his leg, just enough to let him know, no, sir. Yeah. And he knew immediately. And I didn't hit him hard. I gave him a measured dose of discipline.
Right.
That was appropriate for what he had done. That was appropriate, that wouldn't have hurt him, it really just hurt his feelings.
Sure.
He looked at me and was like, but he didn't go near that socket again the rest of the night.
You got his attention.
Right. He didn't go near that socket anymore. Mm-hmm. And even if he were to go back the next day, you have to, as a parent, and I'm learning this even though I only have a 1-year-old, you have to outwill them, right?
Yeah.
When they want, my son will cry and he'll want to go one way, and I'll just look at him and say, life's hard, then you die. I mean, that's what Brother Liddell always told us when we were in school. Yeah. And so that's just how it is. You're going to have moments where you're not going to get your way, and you've got to grow up and be okay with that.
Right.
Because I don't always get my way. You don't always get your way. And what do? We throw a hissy fit. We throw some temper tantrum because we didn't get the cereal we wanted or we didn't get the clothing item that we picked out. And it's not about us as children and as parents. It's about having a will that outlasts their will, because they do have a good, strong will, but they'll lose if you continue to have a strong will. The Bible speaks to this mindset of discipline. Now, I want to preface what I'm going to read because I need to say these things first. There is a belief out there that the rod of correction is the rod of verbal correction. It's this mentality of the words of my mouth are going to be what correct you.
Right.
And it's been pushed and peddled by people who are trying to say discipline has no place in the home physically. Let's look at some verses together. I want to start in Proverbs 13 and verse 24. Proverbs 13:24, where the Proverbs writer says, "He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him, he disciplines him promptly." Well, does it say he who loves him beats him promptly, abuses him promptly, disciplines him? There is a distinction made in the Bible between discipline and abuse.
Right.
In Judges, there's this horrible act of abuse on a woman, and it is condemned in Scripture. It is actually one of those chapters that is uncomfortable to read because of the horrible act that's committed against this woman, against this individual. Mm-hmm. And yet the Bible doesn't speak of that and say, well, she got what was coming to her. Well, she deserved it because she was disobedient. No, it says that was wrong. It's a clear distinction, though, between abusing someone and disciplining someone. You made that distinction. Yeah. I remember reading a book, A Child Called It. I don't know if you've ever read that book mm-hmm. or not, but it tells the account of an individual who grew up in an abusive home. And his own mother even stabbed him with a kitchen butcher knife. Accidentally, mind you, but she was threatening with it and ended up stabbing him. And he had to clean his wound himself. Didn't take him to the hospital. This was his life. And he eventually got away from that situation, and he grew up and he wrote a book about it. And I remember reading that, and at the time I would think, man, my parents are so cruel and harsh and spank me. And then I read that book, and I was about 12 at the time when I read it, and I thought, my mother and father love me. They love me so much. They've never done any of this to me, even close to any of this to me. And it's the mindset of, what's the difference between discipline and abuse? The Bible here says disciplines him promptly, not abuses him.
Right.
But then a couple chapters over in Proverbs 22, I want to notice verse 15. Proverbs 22:15, where it says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him. You know one of the reasons why I know that this can't be verbal? You ever tried to reason with a child? Have you ever seriously tried to sit there and, in fact, there's a man that I work with right now who has a little girl, she's 3 years old, and I eat lunch with their family pretty much every day. And she'll come up to me and she'll say, can I have that? And she'll point at my food and I'll go, no, you have your own food. Why? Well, I have my food. Why? You know how that goes.
Right.
The child's going to continue to say, well, according to the doctrine of rod of correction is verbal correction, I'm then supposed to get into a debate with a 3-year-old about why she can't have my food and try to reason with her. Now, what happens if she comes and tries to take my food? You know what her parents do? They discipline her.
Right.
They either give her a spanking or they send her to a room. They let her know, you're not going to do that. They don't sit there and go, no, we've talked about this. We don't do this. We don't say that. We don't go and do that. They discipline her. Because foolishness is bound up. It's like it's encapsulated inside this child, and you have to beat it out of them. And that's a horrible way to put it sometimes, but sometimes that's what it takes, is a discipline that is going to spank it out of them. That's going to put them in a situation where they know, if I do this, I'm going to get a spanking. I don't want to get a spanking, therefore I will not do this.
Right.
Now here's the other thing I knew. This was just me. When I was in school, if I had the choice between being paddled and being suspended or going to ALC, you know, an alternative learning part of the school where you're in a room by yourself, I always chose the paddle. The reasoning, I knew it was going to hurt and be over with. I have never been spanked or disciplined where the effects lasted so long that I felt like I had been abused.
Right.
I've never felt that way. And I never felt like what I did didn't deserve a spanking, didn't deserve punishment. I understood. I remember my mom and dad would say things to me, and I would know, I did this to myself. It's my fault.
Right.
But there's one passage that's in the next chapter of Proverbs 23:13, and it says, do not withhold correction from a child. Now that right there is something that needs to be touched on, because we have a lot of parents that don't even correct their children, period.
Right.
Well, my child's just a little angel, like you mentioned. And they truly believe that. The problem is, we both know in situations like that of people who, they are not angels.
Yeah.
They're the exact opposite. They're nice in front of mama and daddy, but then they're like demon children, it seems, when they get to be around
They're a
other
fallen
people.
angel.
That's right, a fallen angel. There you go. And that's this mentality. Don't withhold correction from them.
Yeah.
But here's what it says. If you beat him with a rod, he will not die. And then verse 14 says, oh, you shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. Like you said, I'm trying to keep them in the way, the right way.
Right.
I'm not raising my children to grow up to be little heathens, to grow up to be people who are going to be disobedient, who are going to lack respect for authority.
Yeah.
I want to raise children who are going to grow up and say, I'm going to listen to him. I know when the officer is behind me and I may have been speeding or doing something and I've broken the law, and even if I didn't realize it, I know when those lights come on, I better stop,
Yeah.
because I know what'll happen if I don't. I know when my mom and dad would tell me something, I knew I better listen to them or I'm in trouble. Now, here's something interesting about this verse, though. The word there, if I'm to mean then that I'm supposed to use my words to correct my son or my daughter, am I to berate them? Am I to sit there and belittle them with my words? Because if the word there is beat him with a rod, that does incur this mindset of, it's not just a little hit. It's something that would give an incentive to never do something again. Am I to verbally abuse my kid? Obviously not.
Right.
I can't verbally abuse him, but then you look at the word rod there, and it literally is a staff, a branch. It's something like a switch that you would you might remember from the time where people would say, go pick your switch.
Yeah.
This is what we're talking about. But then there's another thing here where it says, he shall not die. It literally means to have one executed. He won't be executed. He won't lose his life. Well, am I then to imagine that I can discipline my son and know that it won't kill him so long as I do it the right way? We did say there's two extremes. There's a fine line you've got to make sure you don't cross. There's the child called It, where the mother's stabbing her son and treating him in such a bad way. And there's the measured dose of discipline. Mm-hmm. And I find it amazing. God's form of discipline many times was death. There are several cases. You mentioned the stoning of our children. Several cases in the Bible where death was involved. And God tells His children, us, to then discipline our children by a measured dose of a spanking.
Right.
I don't beat my kid. I spank him.
And what we need to remember, too, in that, if I can just interject this, is that, you know, death was not the first thing.
Right.
Death was the final thing.
Right.
You know, in those instances, you know, there was disciplining is the whole process, and that's why I used the word even training earlier, because it's the same. Really, that's the same idea. Is to train them in the behavior that they're to have. If not, death could result and would result if they continue on in their evil and unrighteous living and so forth. Then they would be put to death. And that seems like an extreme situation, and obviously we're not living under that law.
Right.
But at the very same time, we're still to be mindful of teaching and training and disciplining. That's the whole process of our children. And sometimes it's hey, no, and sometimes it's a pop on the leg, and sometimes it might be a belt, you know, and so, or it might be a switch or whatever, you know, the case may be. Whatever is you know, measured, and I like that you use that word, that measured punishment, you know, that fits that situation.
Right.
And there again, each child's different. So I know maybe the sensitivity of one child maybe is different than the other. It took maybe a little bit more, a little sterner process with one child maybe than it did the other. And sometimes but at the same time, if I did that one time, the next time I probably didn't have to do that. I could go, hey, no. Mm-hmm. And their attention, they went back to, last time this got me in some bad trouble, and it even hurt.
Yeah.
It got my attention. I don't need to do this. And that's what it's meant to do, you know, to train them in the way that they're supposed to be thinking and supposed to be living out their life. So.
Well, then you think about Amos 4 and verse 6, it says, I gave you cleanness of teeth, and you didn't take them to the dentist.
Right.
He made the famine come into the land, a lack of bread in all your places, and yet you have not returned unto me. And it gets to a point, he says all of these things, multiple verses in the book of Amos, and then he says, therefore, this is what I'm going to do. Because I will do this to you, you better prepare to meet your God, O Israel.
Yeah.
And it was not a good thing to be told, you better prepare to meet me, because I have done everything. This is it.
Yeah.
You will go into captivity. You will be destroyed for what you've done. You will face punishment. The thing you talked about, I want to hit on before we, well, that's probably a bad pun. I want to hit on before we move on to the next part, but I want to touch on this a little bit, which is the activating the brain that says, last time I did this. My son now, I've only had to spank him a couple of times. But now when he gets in trouble, he does this, and he'll look for me. Yeah. And he tries to say, did Dad see me do this? Because if Dad saw me, I may be getting into trouble.
Right.
And he'll do something, and Megan will go, no, and he'll look at me. And I'll look at him and I'll go, no.
Yeah.
And he knows, just like you mentioned.
Right.
He sits there and he'll go, and he'll put his head on Megan to try to like be sweet to her.
Yeah.
And if he's hitting on her in that way, if he's hitting her, no, we don't hit Mama. We're sweet to Mama. Yeah. He'll know that, and he'll recognize that, because the last time he did it, he got a little swat on the hand for doing it. Mm-hmm. He got a little swat on the leg. He got a little swat on the bottom, and he knows, hey, if I do this, they're going to hit back.
Yeah.
I don't just get to hit her and not have any consequence for it, and that's what it is. Actions have consequences.
Absolutely.
Now, kind of switching gears here, there's something else that I definitely want to touch on, and these won't take as much time as the spanking question did, I don't believe, but what would you do if someone says that their children don't need to come back to Sunday evening services or Wednesday night, or that we can't make the gospel meeting or VBS, you know, because we got homework, because we got ball practice? What would you do?
Yeah. Obviously, speaking to homework, you know, and I know that there have been situations, and I've seen it in school systems where there was just so much homework, it was overwhelming. And I've seen kids who come home and immediately begin on homework, and 9, 10 o'clock at night they're still working on homework, and that's a hard thing to overcome. But we're still talking about a time that's been set aside by the elders who have, you know, in that realm, have the authority to set that extra time for us, for that purpose, to be drawn closer to God, for our spiritual growth and for our learning. They're feeding, you know, the flock. They have that responsibility to do so. We, as members of the body, have a responsibility to them to obey them that have the rule over us. Hebrews 13 and verse 17. So they who have made that authority and set aside that time, we have a responsibility to be there Sunday night, if that's been set aside for that time, as well as Wednesday night, and other functions as well would fall into that, gospel meetings and VBSs and anything like that. So, you know, and in those situations, I think you talk to the teachers where they are so overwhelmed. But if it's the case, the child's coming home and playing a video game for an hour over here and goofing off over here for a little while, and then, well, about 6 o'clock, I guess we need to get on that homework, right, so that you can go to bed at a decent hour or two and everything, and then you don't come to services because that, you need to adjust your schedule and think about what is most important. And God truly is, and so we put God first in all of those situations. But remember, and folks don't like to hear that today. They don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that preached. They don't want to hear that, and they see elders as just figureheads. Well, they're just the ones that lead. Well, what is it that they're leading? Because in those situations, they're leading individuals who are rejecting authority, and that is sinful. They are leading individuals who are prioritizing other things first, other than God.
Right.
And so I think that needs to be talked about more. Maybe it needs to be preached on a little bit more, and in a way though that is fitting. It's not just a Hebrews 10, 24 and 25 or verse 25 passage, you know, not forsaking the assembling. It's a coming together to encourage one another. Verse 23 and 24 of that same passage as well. And all of that needs to be preached. And seeking first the kingdom of God, Matthew 6:33. And so putting our priorities in the right place, but realizing there is an authority that's over us. God ultimately, but what are you saying to Him if it's not worth your time to come? So.
Well, the interesting thing, my dad used to tell this illustration, and I know he still does, but when I was growing up, I heard it all the time in gospel meeting settings or whatever, that when he and my mom were engaged, they were not yet living together, obviously, and so she lived in about 2 hours away from him, so she would write him letters. Back before texting and all that other stuff existed, they did that old-fashioned thing called writing letters, and so she would write a letter and send it to him, and he would say from the pulpit, "What do you think I did when I got to the mailbox and saw that I had a letter?" He said, "Do you think I went and took it and put it up on the shelf, and imagine one of my elders stopping by and saying, 'Well, what are all these letters?' 'Oh, well, those are from my fiance. I'm going to get to them at some point. Yeah. I'll look at them sometime.'" He said, "Look, I was opening the letter at the mailbox.
Right.
I was doing everything I could to read and I would be rereading it on my way back up to the house. I wanted to know what my loved one said, what they wanted me to know." When we realize that God knows best, that we love Him because He first loved us in 1 John 4:19, we will be there anytime that we're able. I coach flag football, and I was doing a seminar on suffering, and I couldn't be at one of the games. And I told my players, I said, "Look, I won't be here." And one of them said, "Well, when are we going to practice?" I said, "We'll practice Monday night." "Why not Wednesday night?" "I'm busy. I've got to be at services," and I'd encourage all of you to do that as well. We need to know that our love for God is not measured in whether our homework is done or not. And measured in whether or not we have too much going on, but we only get one life on earth. Therefore, we need to make the most of it because we get an eternal life hereafter.
Right.
Finally, I guess it would be a good thing, especially for me as a young father. What would you do if you're asked, what would you do differently as a young father?
I'd say slow down.
Right.
If I could give myself some advice from back then, slow down a little bit. You know, spend more time together. You know, enjoy the little things that you're doing together. You know, maybe camp more, fish more, hunt more. You know, and somebody say, you know, well, I'm doing that now, so I must be doing pretty good. But back then, I was beginning a career in preaching, and there were a lot of things going on. And at the same time, I was taking classes. But I think the important thing is to make sure that, we spend enough time as a family together. That's quality. And in so doing, things that would draw them closer to God. And so beyond just going to all the services and things, but spending more time even in family devotions than we did. And I think those things are important. And I wish that I would have seen those things earlier. And my boys are basically grown up. I've got one still in the house, but he's about to graduate. There's so much that I would still love to do with them, but so I'm looking back and go, I missed some of that. And some of those were just things that would cause us to have time to be together.
Right.
They might not have mattered to anyone else, but I think about where we are now, and I still love spending time with my boys. So we're going to talk about it as a father. I think that's, I would say slow down a little bit and see your children, spend time with them, do things so that they know who you are and that you truly love them as does God. They need to see that and know that in their life. And so I think that that's important to go back. And I think about that, and so I try to tell young people that all the time.
Right.
These times are important. Don't miss out.
I think it's important to remember what Solomon discovered. When writing Ecclesiastes, he talks about all that he tried to fill his happiness with. I don't remember reading anything about filling that time with children or filling that time with family. I find a lot of external things that he tried, alcohol and being fun and laughter and merriment and all that. But he opens the book by saying, vanity of vanities, says the preacher.
Yeah.
All is vanity. And that word vanity is like, it's vain, it's grasping for the wind. Take a jar outside and try to capture some wind and then open it up and look at it. You're not going to be able to do that. And that's what he understood at this time of his life when writing this. He says, look, I messed up. And he gets to the end of the book and he says, look, you remember the Creator in the days of your youth, 12 verse 1, and the difficult days, you need to do that before the difficult days come.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're going to have the years draw near and you'll say, I have no pleasure in them.
Yeah.
I think Solomon's advice to us young fathers and those of us that have young children and those of us that are fathers in general would be, look, you have a purpose. You have a whole purpose of man, which is to fear God and keep His commandments. Yeah. Make sure you're doing what God expects you to do. He expects you to be a spiritual leader. He expects you to provide for that child. He expects you to correct that child. He expects you to do all of these things. Don't neglect your job. And as a young father, for me, the time is short. He's growing every day.
Yeah.
And I might turn around and be like you are right now, where you're like, he's about to graduate, and then he's out of the house.
Right.
And so we talk about that. I've heard parents say, well, I can't wait. Well, but then they leave, and we do miss them. Yeah. I know I miss being with my mom and dad, even though I'm grown up on my own now. But I guess the advice I'd even give myself right now is, remember the job that you're supposed to do.
Absolutely.
And don't forget that you have a responsibility to love that child, to take care of that child, and to get that child to heaven.
Absolutely. And parenting is serious business, and God took it as serious, and we need to as well.
I know that my Redeemer lives. I know eternal life He gives. I know that my Redeemer lives.